Last Saturday, I was in the Knock bookstore, and I like to see what literature is out there. And they had this book, which was the Catholic Men's Bible. Now, it's not that I don't have Bibles, I have a good few of them, but I'm always interested to see, what is happening in the church? What are people doing to explain the faith better? When somebody goes and takes the time to prepare this Bible, I'm just fascinated to see what did they put in here? What tools have they used? Now, many people will criticize me for oh, you like this translation, you like that translation. I read a wide range of translations of the Bible. I read it in Latin, which I can read. And then I'll read different translations of the Bible in different languages, and I'll read different translations in English. But I'm always fascinated to see, the work that's been done on this, because they have put together some reflections. For example, freed from sin, and the gift of peace. So this is a Bible done by the author is Father Larry Richards. And I do recommend, if you're a man, it's not a bad translation of the Bible. And as I said, guys, I do encourage everybody to please know your faith, so that you can, when you're reading a translation and you say, okay, well, I might have translated something differently here based on that specific word. Know your faith. Know your faith. But there was one thing that was going around in my mind, which was, how can we better teach men to live and love the faith, to love the virtues? Especially young men and the next generation. How are we able to talk about the blockages, the things that block our encounter with Christ, with grace, and so forth? And one of the areas that I don't know why it's so controversial, or it's so badly taught, is the area of men becoming chaste, living chastity. And that word in English, I don't know why it has become so misunderstood that as men we're not able to really meditate on that virtue, which is a key spiritual path. And I was just thinking, in the different languages, how would we tackle this subject in a different languages? And I was thinking, well, how do we say chastity in Polish, for example? Because the English word has a Latin root, castus, and in Polish it has a different root. It's called the word chastity is czystość, and from there you would have the word clarity, clear, czysta woda, czysto nieba, so clear water or clear sky. And what chastity does, one of the key areas of chastity, it does clear our vision of God's plan for us, of what God wants for us in our life. And it's so much more than just the sexual side. It's also putting order in everything that we do in our life, in our relationships with others, and looking for the good in the other, not looking to use them for our pleasure, but to use them for what God, not to use them, but to bring them to know what God wants for them in their life. Too many people don't understand that the faith we have is something that we have to practice. We have to get better at it. We have to move forward, because the devil will always want to leave us in our sin. You're not capable of doing this. And in reality, we are called to more. We are called to love God clearly. We're called to see God clearer in our life. If that virtue, that call was explained in a different way with a different understanding, people might understand how key it is in our life. Because, if you're not chaste as a man, you're constantly looking for pleasure. You're constantly looking for something to fill your soul. because your heart isn't inflamed with something. A chaste person has their heart inflamed with love that is simply, so great that you want to share it with everybody else. But you don't want to be using them to pleasure yourself. This is sadly, in our world today, so many people mistake what love, sex actually mean. What is God's design in my life? What was I designed for? What is that blueprint that God has written in our soul? Because for many people, God doesn't exist. Order doesn't exist. This is the great temptation of this world, to cloud what God has ordered us to cloud the clarity that God brings to our soul. God brings great clarity if we spend time to meditate on Him and His love, on His sacred heart. This is the sad reality in the church today. If you ever listen to these themes or hear what people are talking about these themes, they're so badly taught in the Irish context, in this world. We're desperately bad at talking about this as men, desperately bad. And I do think there's a real call now for Catholics to teach men how to meditate on seeing God clearer in our lives. Because if you read all of the spiritual masters, if you read St. John of the Cross or St. Teresa of Avila, if you read other spiritual masters that are not Catholic, you see this strand where chastity, and it's not just the denial of sex. Chastity is a far deeper concept in the spiritual life. Has many layers, and it's kind of a key pillar if you want to progress. Whatever spiritual journey that person is leading you towards. For example, Buddhism, Hinduism. If you read what they talk and teach about that virtue, it's very, very, very fascinating. They all understood at some level, if you're tied to your own passions, to your own pleasures, disorderly, you will never progress towards enlightenment, what some would call in Eastern theology, in philosophies and so forth. But in Christianity, it's very hard for you to progress towards the way, the truth, and the life, because you're following the ways of the world. Christ didn't say to Mary Magdalene, now go off and continue what you were doing. Go and sin no more. And this world is so tied to pleasing itself. The Love Islands, the Love Island culture. This world is so tied to pleasing. It cannot understand those who are trying to practice a different way, who are ordering their life to the truth that God has to offer us. We have to use our being for what it was designed for, which was to love, with the most amazing encounter that we could any one of us have. And you can read this through, practically every spiritual, if you just read this in, through the different strands of spirituality, through the different saints, it does open souls to this great love, which is encountering the God. It gives the clarity. Now, I wish this word was. I wish we were able to give it a different translation into English, because when you look at this translation, for example, in Polish, czystość, czyste, pure, but clear, clarity. That's what it is. Chastity gives clarity. You know, I'm not moved by my passions. I'm moved by the design of what God wants us to be, to do. You know, a man that loves a woman in chastity, you know, becomes part of God's plan for them and their life. Their sexuality is used for the end that it was meant for, to give life, to bring hope and joy and mystery into this world. You know, the pleasure is to dig deeper into this divine mystery of Christ's love. And you know, none of this great theology, this great spiritual depth of chastity isn't taught. You never hear about it. Very rarely. Very, 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 very rarely. You know, this is why, you know, if somebody does talk about it, you know, you can. It's almost. I remember when somebody would bring up that you'd feel very uncomfortable, or people would be squirming around, and you know, because you know, if you're a teenager, you're all caught up in your passions and so forth, and nobody wants to really challenge Catholics on the spiritual heights of where we were supposed to arrive to in the spiritual life. And those spiritual heights can only be understood when we order our life towards God and via practicing chastity in your state of life. In your state of life, if you're a married man, understanding what you are called to in that marriage, which is a call to sacrifice. It's a call to use your sexuality to God's plan in your life. You know, to love God through your wife, through your children. It should be. You know, this is what they should explain it to us. Sadly, a lot of these concepts are not taught anymore. You know, too many times it's men are talking about your sex life. Men have their sex life. So what you feel, if you're not being nourished in this, maybe it's time to trade up that wife for another woman because women are dispensable. You know, what happens, you know, if tomorrow your wife is left paralyzed? How do you live? How do you love her? You know, if she's not able to dance around for us, then we need to get another one. I mean, this is the sad reality. You know, we're not leading men, especially, to understand the heights of God's love for us. We're not able to lead them into the spiritual path. You know, and it's amazing when people talk about it, they always look, what's Robert saying? Is he repress this or repress that? Yeah, I always wonder when people say that, how insecure are they themselves in their own life? How insecure are they themselves with the call that Christ has in their heart to love him, to know him, to understand him? Because chastity is clarity in the spiritual life. It simply is. If you practice that virtue, it always gives clarity. It always does. I don't know how it works, but when we're not following our passions, when they are kind of more controlled in our life, it's then when God's call, God's voice, the prayer just becomes so much clearer. Comes so much. You're more at peace, and you understand why and what God wants for you in your life. And so I suppose that's really the meditation I'm trying to give you. I'm trying to encourage people to meditate on that, especially men. I'm trying to call them to meditate on what chastity actually means, which is clarity in the spiritual life. That's what it means for me. Clarity in the spiritual life. Clarity to hear God's call for you in your life. Clarity to stop your passions leading you around this way and that way, and to thinking this and doing that. You have clarity now to do something different in your life. To hear God's call. If a man isn't chaste, there is no way There is simply no way you can progress in the spiritual life. There is no way. There's no way out of that. You have to renounce what your passions are calling you to encounter what Christ is calling you to. And you can see that if you study this in different spiritual masters in other religions, you can see this because it's kind of a fundament for any of us, anybody that wants to have so-called enlightenment, but what we Catholics know as the way to Christ. Christ is the way. How did Christ live his life? Was he chaste? Of course, he had the clearest view of God the Father. He was God. He was Son of God. He had the clearest view of God the Father. And you cannot have that view, that conversation with the Father, when your life is consumed in pleasuring yourself and following your passions that are not part of God's plan for you in your life. You know, chastity, you have to practice it. This is the great mistake. You know, we're called to practice these virtues. We're called to practice a faith that will make our encounter with God clearer. You know, that's how I see it in meditation. You know, I wish people, especially in the church, would meditate on this, would draw us into this mystery a little bit more, would teach, would help. I think it's absolutely vital. And as I said, you know, it's just a meditation. It's a meditation that I've been studying, you know, trying to deepen into this. You know, the world always tries to repress God's presence in our life. We'll always do this, either with drugs, with sex, alcohol, video games, distractions. You know, we'll seek the pleasure this, the pleasure that, and food. You know, we'll overeat. The world always tries to, and if we were able to just take a step back and go beyond those things, what would you see? What love would you see? Whose sacred heart would you see? Whose sacred heart would you see if we stepped beyond these pleasures? I mean, it's just my meditation on this, and my call to men to meditate on this virtue in their life, because it's one of the key spiritual stumbling blocks for us. You know, if you're not chaste, it's practically impossible to progress in the spiritual life. If you're not trying to practice that virtue, it's nearly impossible to progress to, you know, beyond just being in discursive prayer. You know, it's hard to enter into contemplation if we're not looking to live chastity in our life, which is clarity. That's all. Replace chastity with the word clarity. Clarity on how we're supposed to act. Clarity on how our sexuality is supposed to be used. Clarity on how we are supposed to love. Clarity on how we're supposed to sacrifice. That's our call. That's our call as men. Our call is to go beyond our, you know, being knocked about on the waves of this world, which oftentimes, I mean, me included, we're knocked about in the waves in this world. We're going from here, we're drawn to this. We're not building our spiritual life on the rock, which is Christ, because we don't have clarity. We're not chaste. That's simply it. And we're drawn to passions. We're drawn to this. We're drawn to criticism. We're drawn to, everybody's the same. They're all men are the same. Sure, they're all doing the same thing. Sure, and we justify everything we do because we're as bad as everyone else. That's a massive temptation. We justify everything we do in our life because look, I'm as bad as your man down there. Sure, look, we're on the same boat. We'll all be drunk together in a pub. We're all comfortable in our sin, and. You know, and sometimes these passions, they can be very destructive. You know, you can have the heights of clarity of God, but you can have the depths of hell. The depths. Men can lead themselves to the depths of hell, and they can lead others. Nobody rapes a woman from one day to the next. That's a whole series of actions, of meditations, of processes, of passions, of leading up to horrific acts. It's a road to that. There's a whole road to that act in that man's life. There's a whole road. How do we stop men walking a road that leads them away from God, that leads them away from their own happiness, their own fulfillment? Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments, but I do want to expand out this topic a little bit more for men. It's one of these things I want to. I was just reading a lot of material and saying what I could quote and so forth, but I suppose I wanted to speak from the heart and to make men understand that chastity is clarity, like in Polish, czystość, czyste, clear, pure, clear. It gives. I like the analogy for clarity. Chastity gives clarity of God. It inflames the heart, but it gives clarity of what we are created for, how we're supposed to love. You know, that's my thoughts on it anyway. Let me know what you think in the comments. God bless. Take care. Bye-bye.